Third Part, Chapter 1 of Essay on the Creative Imagination. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay on the Creative Imagination by Théodule Ribot. Third Part, The Principal Types of Imagination. Chapter 1 The Plastic Imagination. 1. By plastic imagination, I understand that which has for its special characters clearness and precision of form, more explicitly, those forms whose materials are clear images, whatever be their nature, approaching perception, giving the impression of reality, in which, too, there predominate associations with objective relations, determinable with precision. The plastic mark, therefore, is in the images, and in the modes of association of images. In somewhat rough terms, requiring modifications which the reader himself can make, it is the imagination that materializes. Between perception, a very complex synthesis of qualities, attributes, and relations, and conception, which is only the consciousness of a quality, quantity, or relation, often of only a single word accompanied by vague outlines and a latent potential knowledge, between concrete and abstract, the image occupies an intermediate position and can run from one pole to another, now full of reality, now almost as poor and pale as a concept. The representation here styled plastic descends towards its point of origin. It is an external imagination, arising from sensation rather than from feeling, and needing to become objective. Thus its general characters are easy of determination. First and foremost, it makes use of visual images, then of motor images, lastly, in practical invention, of tactile images. In a word, the three groups of images present to a great extent the character of externality and objectivity. The clearness of form of these three groups proceeds from their origin, because they arise from sensation well determined in space, sight, movement, touch. Plastic imagination depends most on spatial conditions. We shall see that its opposite, diffluent imagination, is that which depends least upon that factor, or is most free from it. Among these naturally objective elements, the plastic imagination chooses the most objective, which fact gives its creations an air of reality and life. The second characteristic is inferiority of the affective element. It appears only intermittently, and is entirely blotted out before sensory impression. This form of the creative imagination, coming especially from sensation, aims especially at sensation. Thus it is rather superficial, greatly devoid of that internal mark that comes from feeling. But if it chance that both sensory and affective elements are equal in power, if there is at the same time intense vision adequate to reality, and profound emotion, violent shock, then there arise extraordinary imaginative personages, like Shakespeare, Carlyle, Michelet. It is needless to describe this form of imagination, excellent pen pictures of which have been given by the critics. Thus Taine says of Carlyle, "He cannot stick to simple expression. At every step he drops into figures, gives body to every idea, must touch forms. We see that he is possessed and haunted by glittering or saddening visions. In him every thought is an explosion, a flood of seething passion reaches the boiling point in his brain, which overflows, and the torrent of images runs over the banks and rushes with all its mud and all its splendor. He cannot reason, he must paint." Despite the vigor of this sketch, the perusal of 10 pages of Sartor Resartus or of the French Revolution teaches more in regard to the nature of this imagination than all the commentaries. Let us merely note that its psychology reduces itself to an alternately ascending and descending movement between the two limiting points of perception and idea. The ascending process assigns to inanimate objects life, desires, and feelings. Thus Michelet, the great streams of the Netherlands, tired with their very long course, perish as though from weariness in the unfeeling ocean. For a point of view in criticism that has seemed correct to many on this matter, compare the well-known chapter on the pathetic fallacy by Ruskin in his Modern Painters. Elsewhere, the great folio begets the octavo, which becomes the parent of the small volume, of booklets, of ephemeral pamphlets, invisible spirits flying in the night, creating under the very eyes of tyrants the circulation of liberty. The descending process materializes abstractions, gives them body, makes them flesh and bone. The Middle Ages become a poor child torn from the bowels of Christianity, born amidst tears, grown up in prayer and reverie, in anguish of heart, dying without achieving anything. In this dazzle of images there is a momentary return to primitive animism. 2. In order to more fully understand the plastic imagination, let us take up its principal manifestations. 1. First, the arts dealing with form, where its necessity is evident. The sculptor, painter, architect must have visual and tactile motor images. It is the material in which their creations are wrapped up. Even leaving out the striking acts requiring such a sure and tenacious external vision, portraits executed from memory, exact remembrance of faces at the end of 20 years, as in the case of Gavarni, etc., and limiting ourselves merely to the usual, the plastic arts demand an observant imagination. For the majority of men, the concrete image of a face, a form, a color, usually remains vague and fleeting. Red, blue, black, white, tree, animal, head, mouth, arm, etc., are scarcely more than words, symbols expressing a rough synthesis. For the painter, on the other hand, images have a very high precision of details, and what he sees beneath the words or in real objects are analyzed facts, positive elements of perception and movement. The role of tactile motor images is not insignificant. There has often been cited the instance of sculptors who, becoming blind, have nevertheless been able to fashion busts of close resemblance to the original. This is memory of touch and of muscular sense, entirely equivalent to the visual memory of the portrait painters mentioned above. Practical knowledge of design and modeling, that is, of contour and relief, though resulting from natural or acquired disposition, depends on cerebral conditions, the development of definite sensory motor regions and their connections, and on psychological conditions, the acquisition and organization of appropriate images. We learn to paint and carve, wrote a contemporary painter, as we do sewing, embroidery, sawing, filing, and turning. In short, like all manual labor requiring associated and combined acts. 2. Another form of plastic imagination uses words as means for evoking vivid and clear impressions of sight, touch, movement. It is the poetic or literary form. Of it we find in Victor Hugo a finished type. As all know, we need only open his works at hazard to find a stream of glittering images. But what is their nature? His recent biographers, guided by contemporary psychology, have well shown that they always paint scenes or movements. It is unnecessary to give proofs. Some facts have a broader range and throw light upon his psychology. Thus we are told that he never dictates or rhymes from memory and composes only in writing, for he believes that writing has its own features, and he wants to see the words. Théophile Gautier, who knows and understands him so well, says, "I also believe that in the sentence we need most of all an ocular rhythm. A book is made to be read, not to be spoken aloud." It is added that Victor Hugo never spoke his verses, but wrote them out and would often illustrate them on the margin, as if he needed to fixate the image in order to find the appropriate word. After visual representations come those of movement. The steeple pierces the horizon, the mountain rends the cloud, the mountain raises himself and looks about. The cold caverns open their mouths drowsily. The wind lashes the rock into tears with the waterfall. The thorn is an enraged plant, and so on indefinitely. A more curious fact is the transposition of sonorous sensation or images of sound, and like them without form or figure into visual and motor images. The ruffles of sound that the fifer cuts out. The flute goes up to alto like a frail capital on a column. This thoroughly plastic imagination remains identical with itself, while reducing everything spontaneously, unconsciously, to spatial terms. In literature, this altogether foreign mode of creative activity has found its most complete expression among the Parnassians and their congeners, whose creed is summed up in the formula faultless form and impassiveness. Théophile Gautier claims that a poet, no matter what may be said of him, is a workman. It is not necessary that he have more intelligence than a laborer and have knowledge of a state other than his own, without which he does badly. I regard as perfectly absurd the mania that people have of hoisting them, the poets, up onto an ideal pedestal. Nothing is less ideal than a poet. For him, words have in themselves, and outside the meaning they express, their own beauty and value, just like precious stones not yet cut and mounted in bracelets, necklaces, and rings. They charm the understanding that looks at them, and takes them from the finger to the little pile where they are put aside for future use. If this statement, whether sincere or not, is taken literally, I see no longer any difference, save as regards the materials employed, between the imagination of poets and the imagination active in the mechanical arts. For the usefulness of the one and the uselessness of the other is a characteristic foreign to invention itself. 3. In the teeming mass of myths and religious conceptions that the 19th century has gathered with so much care, we could establish various classifications, according to race, content, intellectual level, and in a more artificial manner, but one suitable for our subject, according to the degree of precision or fluidity. Neglecting intermediate forms, we may, indeed, divide them into two groups. Some are clear in outline, are consistent, relatively logical, resembling a definite historical relation. Others are vague, multiform, incoherent, contradictory. Their characters change into one another, the tales are mixed and are imperceptible in the whole. The former types are the work of the plastic imagination. Such are, if we eliminate Oriental influences, most of the myths belonging to Greece when, on emerging from the earliest period, they attained their definite constitution. It has been held that the plastic character of these religious conceptions is an effect of aesthetic development. Statues, bas reliefs, poetry, and even painting have made definite the attributes of the gods and their history. Without denying this influence, we must nevertheless understand that it is only auxiliary. To those who would challenge this opinion, let us recall that the Hindus have had gigantic poems, have covered their temples with numberless sculptures, and yet their fluid mythology is the opposite of the Greek. Among the peoples who have incarnated their divinities in no statue, in no human or animal form, we find the Germans and the Celts. But the mythology of the former is clear, well kept within large lines, and that of the latter is fleeting and inconsistent, the despair of scholars. It is, then, certain that myths of the plastic kind are the fruits of an innate quality of mind, of a mode of feeling and of translating, at a given moment in its history, the preponderating characters of a race, in short, of a form of imagination, and ultimately of a special cerebral structure. 4. The most complete manifestation of the plastic imagination is met with in mechanical invention and what is allied thereto, in consequence of the need of very exact representations of qualities and relations. But this is a specialized form, and as its importance has been too often misunderstood, it deserves a separate study. See Chapter 5, Infra. 3. Such are the principal traits of this type of imagination. Clearness of outline, both of the whole and of the details. It is not identical with the form called realistic. It is more comprehensive. It is a genus of which realism is a species. Moreover, the latter expression being reserved by custom for aesthetic creation, I purposely digress in order to dwell on this point, that the aesthetic imagination has no essential character belonging exclusively to it, and that it differs from other forms, scientific, mechanical, etc., only in its materials and in its end, not in its primary nature. On the whole, the plastic imagination could be summed up in the expression clearness in complexity. It always preserves the mark of its original source, that is, in the creator and those disposed to enjoy and understand him, it tends to approach the clearness of perception. Would it be improper to consider as a variety of the genus a mode of representation that could be expressed as clearness and simplicity? It is the dry and rational imagination. Without depreciating it, we may say that it is rather a condition of imaginative poverty. We hold with Fouillé that the average Frenchman furnishes a good example of it. The Frenchman, says he, does not usually have a very strong imagination. His internal vision has neither the hallucinative intensity nor the exuberant fancy of the German and Anglo-Saxon mind. It is an intellectual and distant view rather than a sensitive resurrection or an immediate contact with, and possession of, the things themselves. Inclined to deduce and construct, our intellect excels less in representing to itself real things than in discovering relations between possible or necessary things. In other words, it is a logical and combining imagination that takes pleasure in what has been termed the abstract view of life. The Chateaubriands, Hugos, Flauberts, Zolas are exceptional with us. We reason more than we imagine. Its psychological constitution is reducible to two elements: slightly concrete images, schemas approaching general ideas; for their association, relations predominantly rational, more the products of the logic of the intellect than of the logic of the feelings. It lacks the sudden, violent shock of emotion that gives brilliancy to images, making them arise and grouping them in unforeseen combinations. It is a form of invention and construction that is more the work of reason than of imagination proper. Consequently, is it not paradoxical to relate it to plastic imagination as species to genus? It would be idle to enter upon a discussion of the subject here without attempting a classification. Let us merely note the likenesses and differences. Both are above all objective, the first because it is sensory, the other because it is rational. Both make use of analogous modes of association, dependent more on the nature of things than on the personal impression of the subject. Opposition exists only on one point: the former is made up of vivid images that approach perception, the latter is made up of internal images bordering upon concepts. Rational imagination is plastic imagination desiccated and simplified. End of third part, chapter 1.